In the gray dawn of a kingdom both restless and ancient, the stone walls of English castles held more than echoes of wind. They held secrets. Beyond the ceremonial pomp of the Plantagenet court, behind banners that fluttered like whispered promises, a hidden world of influence quietly stirred. England of the late 12th century was a land of contrasts, fertile fields that fed armies, bustling market towns where merchants whispered of fortunes in foreign lands, and silent corridors where unseen hands guided the course of kings. To the common eye, the crown was the center of power, but to those who observed closely, the crown was merely a mask, a polished emblem shielding deeper currents of authority that flowed unseen. It was in this age that Henry II's lineage, the earliest Plantagenets, took root firmly upon English soil, weaving their claims into the very fabric of the realm. By day, the king presided over courtly ceremonies and the administration of justice. By night, his advisors, often men cloaked in humility, their minds sharpened by numbers, law, and arcane knowledge, shaped policies that would endure long after the king's passing. Some were financiers, whose ledgers and letters traced routes of gold and grain across the continent. Others were clerics, whose prayers masked negotiations that could decide the fate of a duchy, a county, or an army. Together, these figures formed a network whose power rivaled, and at times eclipsed, that of the monarch himself. In this chapter of England's unfolding story, one may begin with the bustling port of Portsmouth, where ships prepared to depart for distant shores. Timber creaked under the weight of supplies, ropes scraped against masts, and the scent of brine and tar mingled with the fervent prayers of sailors. These expeditions, often celebrated in chronicles as the king's triumphs, were meticulously organized long before the monarch's name touched the manifest. Merchants in northern France and Italian city-states moved gold and provisions in ways invisible to the average observer, ensuring that when the Plantagenet banner was raised, the stage was already set. The king was the spear, but the minds behind the strategy, the architects of movement, alliances, and influence, remained unseen, observing from shadows and scribal desks alike. England of the late 12th century, the appearance of order masked an intricate dance of power. Feudal lords swore allegiance to the crown, yet their loyalties were often negotiable, carefully balanced by envoys who understood the subtleties of influence far better than any knight. Disputes over land, inheritance, or legal privilege were not simply domestic quarrels. They were chess pieces in a game controlled by those who understood the rhythm of human ambition. Chronicles preserved the outward gestures of kingship, laws enacted, castles built, battles fought, but the real decisions were encrypted in letters, whispered confidences, and ledgers hidden beneath monastic archives. The crown projected authority, yet it was the silent consensus of a hidden elite that truly shaped the kingdom's destiny. Even religion, so often idealized in later accounts, played a quiet but decisive role. Monasteries and abbeys were more than centers of prayer. They were repositories of knowledge, maps, and coded correspondence spanning Europe. Abbot and prior alike could serve as intermediaries between courts, facilitating negotiations that would prevent rebellion or secure an advantageous alliance. In these hushed halls, decisions were made in the interstices of liturgy and scholarship. Kings might claim to act by divine right, but the invisible clergy, well-versed in the politics of both faith and finance, guided many of their steps with careful discretion. The most intriguing aspect of this hidden world, perhaps, was its subtle manipulation of perception. Public ceremonies, royal decrees, and military campaigns all served to reinforce the legitimacy of the Plantagenet image. While the king held audience with petitioners, dined with nobles, and rode at the head of armies, the true architects of strategy shaped outcomes far from view. Successes were attributed to valor, failures blamed on misfortune or treachery. But behind the facade, every maneuver, every carefully timed decree, and every flow of gold was orchestrated with meticulous care. The monarchy was both shield and symbol, concealing the sophisticated web of influence that truly controlled England. Consider the royal forests, which stretched across the countryside like silent witnesses to both power and intrigue. Here, barons hunted and knights trained, while messengers carried encrypted dispatches between abbeys and courts. Decisions about taxation, land allocation, and legal enforcement were often initiated from these shadowed channels, leaving the crown to appear omnipotent while the invisible stewards directed the flow of policy. To the chronicler, the king might have seemed the sole protagonist, but to the careful observer, the story of governance was written in margins, margins that hid the real authors of England's destiny. Even within the walls of Westminster, where the Plantagenets presided over councils and charters, the presence of these hidden forces was palpable, yet imperceptible. Advisors cloaked in loyalty, careful to never appear above the king's station, subtly guided decisions about diplomacy, law, and military planning. Their names seldom reached the annals of history, yet their influence was profound. These figures understood the interplay of wealth, perception, and ambition in a way that no single monarch could. For the crown could command obedience, but it could not shape understanding, nor the subtle currents of alliance that dictated the realm's stability.
The early light of morning draped itself over the rolling countryside of Normandy, spilling softly across the timbered villages and winding rivers. Here, the roots of the Plantagenet dynasty ran deep, entwined with both the soil and the ambitions of men whose names seldom appear in history books. These were the figures who shaped the kingdom before a king ever set foot in court. Stewards, counselors, and financiers, each moving within invisible currents of influence. While the Plantagenet name was proclaimed across halls and battlefields, it was in the quiet study of ledgers and letters that true authority took form. It was during this period that Henry II sought to consolidate his sprawling territories, binding England, Anjou, and Aquitaine into a realm of staggering complexity. Yet the king's outward authority masked a web of dependency upon those whose understanding of power was both subtle and absolute. Strategists ensured that alliances with neighboring lords were secured, trade routes protected, and dissent preemptively neutralized. In a sense, the monarch became a living emblem, a figurehead around which order and loyalty could coalesce, while the architects of strategy shaped the kingdom's trajectory from chambers hidden within abbeys, fortified manors, and secluded halls of governance. Consider, for instance, the negotiations surrounding Aquitaine. The duchy, vast and wealthy, was more than a prize of inheritance. It was a stage upon which merchants, clerics, and knights performed a delicate ballet of influence. Gold flowed silently through conduits stretching from Florence to Bordeaux, funding garrisons, fortifying defenses, and securing loyalty. Correspondence, often encoded, traveled through secret networks, dictating military movements and arranging marriages that reinforced alliances without drawing the glare of public scrutiny. Even as Henry II's name adorned charters, the real orchestration occurred in whispers, in ciphered letters, and in quiet counsel far from the public eye. Within England itself, the influence of this hidden elite was equally profound. Barons and knights, bound by oaths to the crown, were carefully guided toward decisions that would reinforce central authority without understanding the unseen hand that led them. Laws and edicts, while publicly decreed, were frequently the outward manifestation of policy conceived in these quieter chambers. In some instances, the crown's image of absolute rule served only to mask the distributed power of a network of advisors whose knowledge of human ambition, economic systems, and territorial politics far exceeded the king's ceremonial authority. Religious houses played a central role in this silent governance. Monasteries, often depicted in later chronicles as tranquil havens of prayer, were in truth centers of information and influence. Abbot and prior alike mediated disputes, directed correspondence, and safeguarded knowledge that could alter the course of kingdoms. Within their scriptoriums, illuminated manuscripts concealed marginal notes, coded instructions, and financial accounts that provided the backbone for decisions made far from the throne. It was here, in the hushed rhythm of ink on vellum, that some of the kingdom's most consequential strategies were quietly set into motion. Even the military ambitions of the Plantagenets were orchestrated beyond the gaze of ordinary observers. Campaigns, when celebrated as triumphs of kings, were in fact meticulously arranged by advisors who understood logistics, geography, and diplomacy with precision. Supplies were marshaled along predetermined routes, alliances negotiated in silence, and contingents mobilized with timing that seemed almost preordained. Richard the Lionheart, when he would later take the cross for the Holy Land, was but the visible spear of operations conceived long before the first banner was raised. The king embodied valor, yet the pattern of action and the flow of resources were managed by minds hidden in plain sight, unrecorded by chroniclers who favored spectacle over subtlety. Even in the daily life of the court, the Plantagenet image was carefully curated. Ceremonial halls adorned with tapestries depicting legendary victories and divine right conveyed stability to visiting envoys and the populace alike. Yet beyond the glittering chandeliers and polished floors, critical decisions were often taken in private chambers or cloistered corners. It was here that merchants presented discreet accounts. Clerics offered counsel steeped in both theology and politics, and knights reported movements of strategic importance. Every gesture, every document, every negotiation was subtly influenced by those whose primary talent was remaining invisible while directing outcomes with precision. The king's finances, often celebrated in chronicles as proof of wise governance, provide another glimpse of this concealed hierarchy. Revenues collected from taxes, tolls, and rents were carefully funneled through intermediaries whose discretion ensured that the Plantagenet crown appeared both affluent and independent, even as many of the decisions shaping the flow of wealth were made beyond the gaze of any royal auditor. These accounts were not merely numbers. They were instruments of control, enabling silent manipulation of loyalty, influence, and policy across a kingdom that spanned mountains, rivers, and seas. In the midst of this intricate network, the king remained a figure of ceremonial authority, a necessary emblem for the populace and for foreign rulers. Yet the true architects of power were never absent. They were in every ledger, in every letter, and in every subtle negotiation that preserved stability while advancing their own design. The Plantagenet crown gleamed in public ceremonies, but the shadows behind it were deep and enduring, revealing a form of governance both deliberate and elusive, far removed from the simplicity that chroniclers often attributed to monarchy. As dusk settled across Norman hills, a quiet reflection lingered in the corridors of power. The visible hand of kingship, though dazzling, was only part of a larger story. Across abbeys, merchant houses, and secret chambers, the silent operators of influence continued their work, threading together alliances, resources, and information with meticulous care. The kingdom, in all its splendor and turmoil, was shaped not merely by the crown it revered, but by the invisible network whose mastery of strategy and discretion ensured that the Plantagenet mask remained flawless. And as night descended, one could almost hear the faint echo of a question yet unanswered. If kings are but masks, Who, then, truly moves the pieces?
The winds carried a chill along the cliffs of Dover, whispering secrets across the English Channel that only those attuned to subtlety could discern. Here, the Plantagenet presence was both imposing and ceremonial. Castles and fortifications rose as symbols of authority, yet beneath their stone and mortar lay corridors of influence far more intricate than the eye could perceive. It was in these silent spaces, between the march of centuries and the clatter of iron gates, that the real guardians of power wove their strategies, guiding the kingdom with a precision invisible to the populace. In the early decades of the Plantagenet reign, diplomacy was a landscape of shadows. Treaties were signed and alliances proclaimed, yet behind the grand proclamations, a network of advisors, clerics, and financiers quietly shaped outcomes. They understood the delicate art of leverage, the subtle interdependence of loyalties, and the silent threats that could alter the course of a kingdom. The Plantagenets, for all their ceremonial authority, often served as intermediaries for decisions carefully orchestrated in chambers where maps, letters, and ledgers dictated moves with far greater consequence than any royal edict could convey. Consider the intricate negotiations with France, whose dukes and counts were both allies and adversaries in a dance that spanned decades. The Plantagenets' claims to continental territories were not simply matters of inheritance. They were maintained through invisible diplomacy, credit arrangements, and strategic marriages arranged long before the public was aware of their implications. Florence, Bordeaux, and Paris all became hubs in a web of influence where gold, information, and loyalty intertwined. While kings rode forth to negotiate treaties or attend councils, the silent architects of these plans were often cloaked as clerics, emissaries, or even merchants, their movements unnoticed yet pivotal. Within England, the balance of power was equally subtle. Barons, ostensibly independent in their fiefs, were guided by advisors who knew how to exploit both ambition and fear without resorting to open confrontation. Laws and decrees, celebrated in chronicles as the king's wisdom, were often the outward face of policies designed and refined by this hidden elite. The Plantagenets' authority provided legitimacy. The true decisions were made in the margins of courtly correspondence, in ledgers detailing loans and payments, and in monastic archives carefully shielded from prying eyes. It was a kingdom orchestrated with finesse, where appearance and reality were intentionally misaligned. The clergy, far from being passive observers, wielded significant influence in these affairs. Monks and abbots, trained in logic, theology, and administration, often functioned as intermediaries, negotiators, and strategists. They safeguarded knowledge that could determine the rise or fall of a lord, the allocation of resources, or the outcome of a military campaign. Letters written in careful cipher traveled from cloister to cloister, carrying instructions or intelligence invisible to all but those who understood the subtle code. The Plantagenets were the public face of the realm, yet these clerical networks quietly dictated the rhythm of governance, wielding a power that was both pervasive and discreet. The orchestration extended to the military sphere as well. Campaigns, when later chronicled as heroic endeavors of kings and knights, were in fact meticulously prepared by advisors who understood geography, supply lines, and the unpredictability of human behavior. The Third Crusade, though celebrated in the name of Richard the Lionheart, was only possible through a carefully coordinated system of funding, logistics, and political negotiation, work carried out by men who operated beyond the glare of heralds and chroniclers. Kings led armies into battle, but the strategy, the movement of gold, and the timing of reinforcements were guided by those who preferred obscurity to recognition. Even the ceremonial aspects of the Plantagenet court served a calculated purpose. Banquets, tournaments, and public proclamations were not mere entertainment, they were instruments of influence, carefully designed to reinforce the image of unassailable authority. While knights displayed valor and barons pledged fealty, advisors observed, recorded, and adjusted the subtle levers of control that governed loyalty, resources, and perception. Every flourish of the crown, every ornate banner, and every solemn oath contributed to a carefully constructed illusion, a mask that concealed the true engines of power. Within the halls of Westminster, councils met, disputes were settled, and decisions were publicly recorded. Yet even here, the real shaping of policy often occurred elsewhere, in private chambers, cloistered libraries, and discreet gatherings where advisors could act without the pressure of ceremony. Merchants' letters, papal correspondence, and financial accounts provided insight and leverage. The king's image remained central, but the invisible architects moved with quiet precision, ensuring that the kingdom's trajectory aligned with strategies designed to endure beyond any royal tenure. By twilight, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and mist rolled across the countryside, England appeared outwardly serene. Castles glimmered in fading light, and the banners of the Plantagenets signaled stability. Yet the truth lingered in shadowed corners, a web of influence stretching from abbeys to trading ports, from secluded manors to royal chambers, orchestrated events with careful deliberation. Kings remained the visible emblem, but power flowed along hidden channels, governed by minds who understood patience, foresight, and discretion in ways that outlasted any royal tenure. And as night enveloped the land, a quiet mystery remained. While the Plantagenets displayed authority, it was the unseen network of strategists, clerics, and financiers who truly guided the kingdom. Their work was silent, deliberate, and hidden, yet it shaped the fate of England in ways that kings, chroniclers, and even the people themselves could scarcely perceive. Beyond the crowns and ceremonies lay the subtle artistry of governance, a shadowed realm where influence moved unseen, and where the question lingered like mist over the cliffs of Dover. Who truly held the reins of power?
A thin fog rolled over the River Thames, muffling the footsteps of those who traversed the wooden docks and stone bridges of medieval London. The city, a hive of commerce and law, was alive with the muted rhythms of daily life, merchants calling prices in the market, barges gliding silently along the water, and the distant toll of a bell marking the passing hour. Yet amid this ordinary clamor, an invisible orchestration unfolded, a silent hand guiding trade, politics, and the flow of information. Here, more than in any battlefield or royal hall, the subtleties of real power were revealed. The Plantagenet monarchy, for all its grandeur, relied upon networks of advisors who understood the economy, politics, and diplomacy with astonishing clarity. The crown was the symbol, the authority in the public eye, yet many of the kingdom's most consequential decisions, ranging from taxation to military provisioning, were conceived and executed beyond the gaze of the monarch. Merchants in London's bustling lanes corresponded with financiers in Florence and Bruges, moving sums of gold that would fund armies, fortify castles, and ensure loyalty across the continent. The Plantagenets with a visible face, but the unseen strategists orchestrated the motions of wealth with precision. Trade, in particular, was a conduit of influence. Wool, wine, and grain were not merely commodities, they were instruments of power. Advisors monitored the flow of goods, controlling supply to reinforce allegiance and manipulate markets in subtle ways. Taxes levied upon towns and ports were carefully calculated to maintain the illusion of royal benevolence, while simultaneously strengthening the hidden networks of the elite. The king's name appeared on charters and proclamations, but behind every decree, a council of minds worked tirelessly to shape outcomes in ways that the public, and sometimes even the monarchy itself, could scarcely perceive. Religious institutions remained central to this invisible architecture. Monasteries in London, Canterbury, and along the coast were repositories not only of faith, but of intelligence. Abbot and prior, ostensibly devoted solely to spiritual guidance, often played key roles in the kingdom's administration. Through discreet correspondence and coded manuscripts, they transmitted information about trade, rebellion, and political sentiment, influencing decisions that affected every corner of the realm. The Plantagenets, while publicly guiding their kingdom, relied heavily upon these clerical intermediaries, whose counsel often determined the success or failure of both domestic and foreign policies. Civic administration was subtly manipulated to serve broader strategies. Laws were enacted, charters granted, and disputes arbitrated, yet many of these actions masked deeper intentions. Advisors ensured that loyalty was maintained, dissent minimized, and power concentrated in ways that reinforced the crown's image while advancing their own strategic objectives. It was a delicate balance: visible authority maintained for the sake of legitimacy, invisible control exercised for the sake of stability and influence. Kings, therefore, functioned as both emblem and instrument, their authority amplified by those who mastered the art of discretion. Military preparation, too, was woven into this intricate framework. The deployment of troops, the construction of fortifications, and the planning of campaigns were seldom the spontaneous acts of monarchs. Instead, they were carefully choreographed by networks of strategists who accounted for supply lines, loyalty of commanders, and even the unpredictable temperament of barons. The Plantagenets' participation in Crusades and continental conflicts, celebrated in chronicles as feats of bravery, often depended on resources and plans marshaled in silence, far from the banners and trumpets of public ceremony. Kings became symbols, while strategy, timing, and logistics were the work of the unseen. One of the most remarkable features of this hidden power was its subtle manipulation of perception. Royal proclamations and public ceremonies reinforced an image of absolute monarchy, yet they also served to conceal the real mechanisms of control. Festivals, tournaments, and courtly audiences were not merely entertainment, they were instruments of influence, designed to reinforce hierarchy and social order, while masking the intricate networks operating behind the scenes. The Plantagenets' image was carefully curated, their gestures calculated to inspire loyalty and awe, even as decisions of true consequence were executed by those who remained deliberately invisible. The corridors of Westminster, with their echoing chambers and illuminated halls, bore witness to this duality. While councils convened and charters were signed, the real deliberations often occurred elsewhere, in quiet rooms where the king was advised by clerics, financiers, and seasoned strategists. Every letter, account, and memorandum carried with it a hidden purpose. The Plantagenet crown provided the authority, but the shadowed network behind it determined the trajectory of events, ensuring that every action aligned with carefully laid plans. As twilight descended, painting the Thames with shades of gold and gray, the city seemed serene and ordered. Yet beneath the surface,
the machinery of influence continued its silent operation. Gold moved along unseen channels, letters traversed secret routes, and councils shaped decisions invisible to the public eye. The kingdom's apparent stability rested on a delicate balance of perception and reality, maintained by those who understood that power is rarely displayed in full, but is often most potent when hidden. And as darkness enveloped the city, a lingering question emerged from the quiet streets and shadowed halls. While the Plantagenets wore the crown, who truly orchestrated the rhythm of England's life? In the flickering candlelight of London's towers, the answer remained elusive, hidden in the margins of accounts, the subtle counsel of clerics, and the quiet discretion of those who understood that true authority often moves unseen, shaping history from the shadows.
The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, softening the contours of villages and manor houses into shadows of their true form. In this tranquil landscape, the outward serenity of England belied the subtle machinations that governed its fate. The Plantagenets, adorned in crowns and robes of state, were the visible embodiment of authority, yet beneath their public gestures existed a lattice of influence, an invisible council of minds whose strategies shaped kingdoms and alliances with quiet precision. It was during the reign of Henry II that the complexity of this hidden power became most evident. His ambition stretched from the northern reaches of England to the southern coasts of France, yet he relied heavily upon advisors whose understanding of diplomacy, finance, and human nature far surpassed the ceremonial knowledge of kingship. These figures, clerics, financiers, and seasoned counselors, worked in secret, orchestrating marriages, alliances, and military campaigns that would secure the dynasty's dominance. While the king commanded armies and issued proclamations, the invisible hand of strategy moved silently, anticipating obstacles and ensuring that each decision served a larger, hidden design. Trade and finance were central to this quiet governance. English wool, prized across Europe, was more than a commodity, it was a tool of influence. Merchants, often acting in concert with clerical and noble intermediaries, coordinated shipments, manipulated markets, and funneled wealth in ways that ensured both the crown's appearance of power and the stability of its networks. Letters, accounts, and coded messages moved along secret routes, dictating the flow of resources with remarkable subtlety. The Plantagenets became the figurehead of success, while the architects of strategy shaped the kingdom's prosperity in ways visible only to those who knew where to look. Even within the feudal system, the hidden elite exercised remarkable control. Barons, ostensibly independent in their fiefs, were subtly guided through alliances, negotiations, and financial incentives. Laws and charters, recorded in illuminated manuscripts and proclaimed in courts, often reflected the intentions of those behind the scenes rather than the immediate will of the monarch. The Plantagenet crown, while respected and revered, was as much a tool of perception as it was a seat of authority. Power operated in layers. The ceremonial acts of kings reinforced legitimacy, while the unseen council of advisors ensured that the kingdom moved according to carefully laid plans. Religious institutions played a pivotal role in this architecture of influence. Monasteries, cathedrals, and abbeys were repositories of both faith and knowledge. Clerics, trained in theology, law, and diplomacy, acted as intermediaries and strategists. Their correspondence, often encoded, guided decisions ranging from military logistics to territorial disputes. The Plantagenets were outwardly the guardians of faith and law, Yet the clergy often determined the practical application of these principles. Through subtle guidance and discreet intervention, they shaped the kingdom's course without ever stepping into the spotlight. Military campaigns, too, were products of quiet orchestration. While knights and kings appeared at the forefront of battles, the logistics, timing, and strategic objectives were often set by advisors whose work went unnoticed. The deployment of troops, the provisioning of supplies, and the negotiation of alliances were all carefully controlled to maintain the appearance of royal initiative. The Plantagenets' public image celebrated heroism and leadership, yet the invisible hand ensured that their victories and their setbacks fit into a broader design intended to secure influence and continuity for generations. Even in the seemingly mundane routines of daily governance, the crown relied on its hidden apparatus. Taxes, tolls, and rents were calculated not merely for revenue, but as instruments of control. Letters from distant merchants, reports from abbeys, and records of court disputes were meticulously analyzed by advisors who shaped policy with subtlety and foresight. The Plantagenets became both the emblem and the mask, while those who understood the kingdom's deeper rhythms directed its course with precision and discretion. As evening fell over the Cotswold Hills, the villages were bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, and the stone towers of manors cast long shadows across the fields. To the casual observer, the kingdom seemed orderly, governed by the visible hand of monarchy, yet the truth was far more intricate. A network of strategists, clerics, and financiers quietly guided events, ensuring that every act of kingship, every military campaign, and every diplomatic negotiation served a calculated purpose. The Plantagenets' authority was real, yet it was inseparable from the work of those who remained unseen, moving in the shadows to maintain the kingdom's delicate balance. And as night deepened, a quiet, persistent thought lingered in the silent halls and along the empty roads. The crown is but a symbol, brilliant yet hollow without the hidden hands that guide it. Who then truly governs a kingdom when kings are but masks? In the candle-lit chambers and misted valleys, the answer remained hidden, waiting for those patient enough to follow the subtle currents of power that flowed beneath the surface of England's medieval world.
A cold wind swept through the stone ramparts of Dover Castle, carrying with it the faint salt of the Channel and the whispers of distant lands. The Plantagenet banner fluttered above the towers, a visible assertion of authority, yet beneath its folds, the kingdom's fate was quietly guided by minds whose influence remained hidden. Beyond the ceremonial duties of kingship, a network of advisors, financiers, and clerics orchestrated the subtleties of power, ensuring that England's course aligned with plans known only to a select few. In these years, the Plantagenets' continental possessions demanded constant attention. Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine were not mere inheritances. They were intricate systems of governance, diplomacy, and commerce. The outward authority of the crown masked the constant movement of resources, intelligence, and strategy. Advisors moved through courts and abbeys alike, mediating disputes, negotiating alliances, and directing the flow of information. The king, while omnipresent in public ceremonies, was often but the face of decisions meticulously prepared in chambers where strategy and foresight held sway over spectacle and pageantry. The economy of the realm functioned as both lifeblood and instrument of control. English wool, shipped to the markets of Flanders and Italy, was a tool for influence as much as it was a source of revenue. Merchants communicated with abbeys and noble houses through coded letters and ledgers,
ensuring that trade strengthened loyalty and reinforced the crown's appearance of power. Gold moved along hidden channels, funding garrisons, fortifications, and military campaigns. While the Plantagenets' name was associated with wealth and authority, it was the unseen financiers and strategists who orchestrated these flows, wielding influence in silence and precision. Even within the domestic realm, the feudal structure was guided by invisible hands. Barons, ostensibly independent in their fiefs, were subtly influenced by intermediaries who understood their ambitions, rivalries, and fears. Laws and royal decrees, while proclaimed in grand ceremony, often served as a facade, masking decisions made by those who preferred discretion to recognition. The crown projected power, yet the invisible network ensured that loyalty, obedience, and stability were maintained through subtle, calculated measures. In this intricate dance, the Plantagenets were both emblem and instrument, their authority reinforced and controlled by those who never sought the spotlight. Religious institutions remained central to this hidden governance. Abbeys, cathedrals, and monasteries were repositories not only of knowledge, but of intelligence. Clerics acted as mediators, advisors, and strategists, transmitting information and guidance through letters, reports, and coded manuscripts. Their counsel often determined the allocation of resources, the resolution of disputes, and the success of military operations. The Plantagenets, while publicly the guardians of faith and order, relied upon these hidden clerical networks to ensure that the kingdom's administration operated smoothly, efficiently, and according to plans that extended far beyond any single reign. Military campaigns, although often celebrated as expressions of royal valor, were in reality products of careful orchestration. Advisors controlled logistics, timing, and alliances, coordinating armies in ways that the public rarely witnessed. The preparation for each expedition, from securing provisions to negotiating support from continental allies, was meticulously arranged by those who understood the interplay of power, finance, and human ambition. The king's role, while ceremonially commanding, was supported and guided by an invisible network whose work was essential to the success of the campaign. Even the daily rituals of court life were infused with subtle strategy. Audiences, banquets, and tournaments served to reinforce the image of authority, while simultaneously allowing the hidden network to observe loyalty, assess ambition, and gather intelligence. Every gesture, every word, and every ceremonial act contributed to a carefully constructed illusion. The Plantagenets projected control and grandeur, yet the mechanisms of governance were often invisible, operating quietly beneath the surface. As night fell, shrouding the countryside and coast in a veil of darkness, the machinery of influence continued its silent operation. Letters traveled along secret routes, resources flowed along hidden channels, and counsel guided decisions far from the public eye. The kingdom appeared orderly and stable, yet it was the work of the unseen elite, the strategists, clerics, and financiers, that ensured that every public act of kingship aligned with broader designs. And so, as the moonlight glimmered across Dover's cliffs and the Channel waves whispered against the rocks below, a persistent thought lingered in the shadows. The crown is only a mask, brilliant but hollow, unless guided by hands that remain unseen. Who then truly commands a kingdom when kings are but the visible emblem? In the silence of stone halls and the mist over distant fields, the answer waits, concealed in the subtle currents of influence that shape history from the shadows.
A pale dawn settled over the forests of Windsor, filtering through the tall oaks and casting elongated shadows across the castle walls. The Plantagenet banners swayed gently in the morning breeze, their colors bright and heraldic, yet beneath the pageantry, the kingdom's destiny was quietly molded by minds whose names rarely survived the annals of history. Here, amid stone towers and manicured grounds, the true custodians of power orchestrated England's affairs, wielding influence with discretion, foresight, and a subtle understanding of human nature that no monarch alone could match. By this time, the Plantagenet dynasty had grown into a complex tapestry of territories, marriages, and alliances, stretching from the Scottish border to the southern coasts of France. While kings presided over court, knights prepared for campaigns, and barons managed their fiefs, a shadow network of advisors guided the machinery of governance. These were clerics adept in diplomacy, financiers familiar with continental trade, and strategists who read the subtleties of loyalty and ambition like a carefully penned map. Their counsel often dictated the timing of marriages, the negotiation of treaties, and the allocation of resources, all while the king's public image remained one of commanding authority. Trade remained a potent instrument of influence. The movement of wool, wine, and grain across ports from London to Bordeaux and further into Italian city-states was carefully managed to ensure political and economic stability. Merchants acted not only as traders, but also as agents within this hidden web, carrying letters and accounts whose contents could sway barons, influence abbots, or redirect royal attention. Gold flowed along these networks, funding fortifications, armies, and subtle bribes that secured loyalty, all without ever appearing in the chronicles of historians who focused on visible acts of kingship. Religious houses continued to wield quiet but decisive power. Monks and abbots, ostensibly devoted to prayer and scholarship, often served as intermediaries in negotiations that could determine the outcome of disputes or the success of campaigns abroad. Their archives held records of alliances, codes, and strategic instructions that guided the actions of both barons and kings alike. The Plantagenets' authority derived as much from the support and discretion of these religious networks as from the swords and banners that symbolized power to the populace. The military ambitions of the Plantagenets, celebrated in song and story, were likewise shaped in the shadows. Every campaign, whether along the Scottish borders or on continental soil, depended on meticulously coordinated logistics, the loyalty of commanders, and the timing of reinforcements, all orchestrated by the invisible network. Kings led armies with courage and skill, yet the strategy, movement of supplies, and diplomatic negotiations were controlled by those whose influence remained largely unrecorded. Victory and defeat alike were shaped as much by foresight and planning as by the valor of knights in battle. Within the daily life of the court, ceremonial acts served both to reinforce authority and to conceal the true mechanisms of governance. Tournaments displayed martial prowess, banquets showcased wealth, and public audiences maintained the image of a benevolent king. Yet behind the scenes, advisors observed, gathered intelligence, and directed the flow of decisions that would ensure both stability and loyalty. Each gesture, each proclamation, each intricate performance was a carefully crafted instrument designed to maintain the illusion of complete royal control, while the real work of governance occurred in silence. Even in the realm of law and taxation, the crown relied upon this invisible web. Charters and decrees were tools of perception as much as instruments of authority. Barons, knights, and townsfolk followed the letter of the law, yet their actions were often guided by subtle pressures and incentives devised by those operating in secrecy. The Plantagenet image of justice and command was reinforced, but it was the hidden network of strategists and clerics that ensured obedience, loyalty, and the smooth functioning of a kingdom whose complexity would have overwhelmed any single monarch. As dusk settled over Windsor, painting the castle walls in shades of amber and gray, the kingdom seemed both orderly and serene. Yet the reality of power remained largely invisible. Gold, letters, Alliances and council moved quietly through channels that the crown projected but did not always control directly. Every public act, every ceremony, every proclamation was meticulously aligned with broader, often unseen strategies that ensured the continuity of influence across generations. And so, as night descended and the forests whispered under the silver light of the moon, one truth lingered in the shadows of the towers and corridors. The Plantagenets wore crowns and held swords, yet the true shaping of England rested in the careful hands of those who operated beyond public view. The kingdom's destiny was guided not only by valor and ceremony, but by the subtle, deliberate orchestration of invisible architects whose presence remained hidden, ever watchful, ever precise, and ever essential.
A gray mist clung to the banks of the river Severn, drifting silently through the villages and meadows that stretched toward the distant hills. The Plantagenet coat of arms glimmered atop towers and halls, proclaiming authority to all who passed. Yet, beneath the public display of power, England's destiny was quietly directed by a network of minds whose presence was seldom recorded. It was a kingdom managed in whispers and careful calculations, where perception was as essential as policy, and the crown itself was a mask concealing deeper currents of influence. During this period, Henry II's legacy and the ambitions of his successors extended across an intricate web of territories, alliances, and obligations. Kings were the visible arbiters of law and order, yet many of the most consequential decisions were made by advisors whose expertise lay in diplomacy, finance, and the delicate management of loyalty. These figures moved through royal courts, abbeys, and merchant halls alike, negotiating marriages, securing trade routes, and influencing barons whose allegiance was vital to the stability of the realm. While the Plantagenets' presence was ceremonial, the strategy that sustained their authority flowed from these unseen hands. Trade continued to serve as a subtle instrument of control. Wool, the kingdom's most lucrative export, traversed ports and rivers, reaching markets in Flanders, Florence, and beyond. Merchants, often acting as intermediaries for clerics and nobles, carried messages, monitored markets, and subtly reinforced loyalty through the movement of goods and gold. Financing military campaigns, maintaining garrisons, and securing alliances depended on these flows, which were coordinated in secrecy. The Plantagenet's name was associated with wealth and authority, but the invisible financiers and strategists ensured that economic power supported political and military objectives. Religious institutions played an equally pivotal role. Monasteries and abbeys were repositories not only of spiritual knowledge, but of political intelligence. Abbots and priors mediated disputes, relayed information, and guided the monarch in matters both temporal and ecclesiastical. Encoded letters and carefully guarded records allowed them to coordinate strategies across vast distances, subtly shaping events without public acknowledgement. In this system, kings were symbols of legitimacy, yet it was the clerical network that often directed the practical exercise of authority. Military expeditions, even those celebrated in chronicles as heroic endeavors of Plantagenet kings, were carefully orchestrated behind the scenes. Logistics, troop movements, and alliances were managed by advisors whose understanding of geography, supply, and human behavior surpassed that of even the most experienced monarchs. Battles were fought with courage and skill, but success depended upon the meticulous preparation of those who preferred discretion to recognition. The kings' names were etched into the annals of history, yet the true architects of strategy remained unseen, their contributions recorded only in marginal notes and ledgers. Even within the royal court, ceremonial acts served dual purposes. to reinforce the appearance of absolute authority and to mask the true mechanisms of control. Banquets, tournaments, and public audiences allowed advisors to assess loyalty, observe ambition, and gather intelligence. Every ritual, every gesture, every proclamation contributed to the illusion of monarchy, while the hidden network manipulated the levers of power with precision. The Plantagenets' authority was real, yet inseparable from the guidance and subtle influence of those who remained in the shadows. As evening fell over the Severn Valley, painting the hills and river in muted shades of silver and blue, the kingdom appeared calm and orderly. Yet beneath the veneer of ceremony and authority, a network of strategists, clerics, and financiers continued their quiet work, threading alliances, resources, and intelligence into the fabric of governance. The Plantagenets' crown gleamed in the twilight, but the true power of England lay in the deliberate, hidden orchestration that sustained it. And as night deepened, a persistent question remained, echoing along the river and through the stone halls of castles. The crown is visible, the banners fly, but who truly guides the course of the kingdom when kings are merely the symbols of authority? In the stillness of candlelit chambers and fog-draped valleys, the answer remained concealed, held by the invisible hands that shaped history from the shadows, their presence known only to the careful observer.
The horizon glimmered with the first light of dawn over the rolling hills of the Welsh marches, where stone keeps rose like sentinels against the morning mist. From afar, the Plantagenet banners proclaimed dominion, their heraldic colors of visible assertion of power. Yet behind every raised flag, every fortified gate, there existed a deeper, hidden order, a network of minds who understood that monarchy, though ceremonial, was only as effective as the discretion and strategy guiding it. By now, the Plantagenets had firmly established their presence across England, Normandy, and parts of Ireland. Yet the sprawling territories required more than a monarch's attention. They demanded a subtle coordination of finance, loyalty, and diplomacy. Clerics with a knowledge of law and theology, financiers familiar with the complexities of continental trade, and seasoned counselors well-versed in the delicate psychology of barons worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Their movements were quiet, their influence pervasive, and their methods often invisible, ensuring that the kingdom operated smoothly while presenting an image of centralized authority. Trade continued to serve as a conduit of power. England's wool, transported across rivers and ports to the cities of the Low Countries and Italy, was not only a source of wealth, but a tool of influence. Merchants, functioning as both traders and covert intermediaries, ensured the flow of goods and capital aligned with the strategic interests of the hidden elite. Resources were allocated, alliances reinforced, and potential dissent mitigated, all while the crown remained the public symbol of prosperity. Kings were celebrated in chronicles, yet it was the invisible network that managed the economy's most consequential currents. Religious institutions maintained an essential role within this hidden architecture. Monks, abbots, and priors were repositories of knowledge, acting as both advisors and intermediaries. Through correspondence, codified messages, and meticulous records, they influenced military campaigns, territorial disputes, and diplomatic negotiations. The Plantagenets depended upon this clerical infrastructure, whose counsel often proved as decisive as any battle or treaty. In many ways, these men and women of faith were the quiet arbiters of a kingdom whose visible authority was embodied in the monarch's crown. The orchestration of military campaigns remained equally discreet. Every march, siege, or battle was prepared with meticulous care by those whose expertise transcended the ceremonial prowess of kings.
Advisors coordinated logistics, ensured supplies, and negotiated support with allies, all while maintaining the illusion that strategy flowed solely from the monarch. Valor and chivalry were displayed in public, yet success depended upon the meticulous work of those who preferred anonymity. In this system, the Plantagenets were the visible spear, but the tip was guided by unseen hands. Even the ceremonial life of the court was infused with subtle strategy. Tournaments, feasts, and public audiences were carefully arranged to project stability and reinforce hierarchy, while simultaneously providing opportunities for the hidden network to assess loyalty, gather intelligence, and direct influence. Every gesture of kingship, from the handing of a scepter to the distribution of favors, contributed to a carefully maintained illusion. The crown was real, yet inseparable from the quiet orchestration that ensured its authority remained intact. Law and taxation functioned as instruments of subtle control. Charters, proclamations, and legal decrees conveyed justice and order, but they also masked the deliberate orchestration behind them. Barons, knights, and townsfolk operated under the impression of direct royal authority, while intermediaries guided their decisions, aligned loyalties, and reinforced the stability of the kingdom. The crown projected omnipotence, the unseen council ensured it. As dusk settled across the Welsh marches, the stone keeps cast long shadows over valleys bathed in twilight. England appeared serene, orderly, and under firm control. Yet the true strength of the kingdom lay not in crowns or banners, but in the hidden architecture of influence and strategy. Advisors, clerics, and financiers continued their work quietly, threading the kingdom's destiny together with patience, subtlety, and foresight. And as night cloaked the marches in mist and shadow, a lingering question haunted the quiet corridors of power. Kings may reign and banners may fly, but who truly guides the fate of a kingdom when the crown is a mask and the real architects of power remain unseen? In the hush of candlelit chambers and fogged valleys, the answer rested in the shadows, known only to those who understood that true authority often moves where no eye can follow.
The moon rose high above the Tower of London, casting silver light over the city's stone walls and winding streets. The Plantagenet banners fluttered gently in the night air, a symbol of continuity and authority that had endured for generations. Yet beneath the grandeur and ceremony, the kingdom's true power remained unseen, held in the hands of those who orchestrated events with deliberate precision, guiding kings, barons, and clergy alike. The crown was the mask. Behind it, history moved quietly under the direction of a hidden elite. In the decades of Plantagenet rule, England had expanded and contracted under wars, treaties, and marriages, yet the underlying architecture of influence remained remarkably consistent. Clerics advised with discretion, financiers directed resources along invisible channels, and counselors coordinated diplomacy and military strategy. The crown provided legitimacy and visibility, but the real decisions, who fought, who married, who prospered, were often made in secret, far from the eyes of chroniclers and courtiers. History, as it was recorded, reflected the spectacle, while the subtle currents of power flowed quietly beneath the surface. Trade and wealth continued to serve as instruments of influence. England's exports of wool, its ports bustling with merchants and ships, created an intricate web connecting local markets to Florence, Bruges, and beyond. Gold moved silently, funding armies, fortifying castles, and ensuring loyalty. Letters encoded in secrecy passed between abbeys, manors, and trading houses, dictating actions that shaped the kingdom's fate. Kings were celebrated for victories and alliances, yet it was the hidden network that ensured these outcomes were both possible and enduring. The role of religious institutions remained pivotal. Monks and abbots, entrusted with both spiritual and temporal knowledge, advised kings, mediated disputes, and safeguarded intelligence across distances that challenged ordinary communication. They understood that influence extended far beyond prayer and ritual. It flowed through archives, correspondence, and careful counsel. The Plantagenets were the public embodiment of authority, but the clergy were the quiet architects of governance, guiding the visible hand of the crown while remaining largely unacknowledged in public history. Military campaigns, often romanticized in legend, were likewise products of invisible orchestration. Battles were preceded by months of meticulous preparation, supplies marshaled, alliances confirmed, and contingents deployed according to plans devised in private councils. Kings led their armies with valor, but victory depended upon the careful coordination of logistics, diplomacy, and intelligence. The crown took credit, chroniclers recorded heroism, yet the unseen strategists remained the true engineers of success. Even the daily rituals of court life reinforced the illusion of absolute monarchy. Tournaments, feasts, and ceremonies displayed wealth and authority, while allowing the hidden network to observe loyalty, ambition, and temperament. Each gesture and decree was a calculated part of a larger design, where perception and reality were deliberately intertwined. The Plantagenets remained the mask, projecting stability and control, while the hidden hands of advisors ensured the continuity of influence. As the night deepened over London, a quiet reflection settled upon the city. Stone towers gleamed in moonlight, the river shimmered, and the kingdom seemed serene and orderly. Yet beneath the surface, the silent networks of power continued their work, threading together diplomacy, finance, military strategy, and ecclesiastical counsel. England's destiny was shaped not only by the crown, but by those who remained unseen, orchestrating events with patience, subtlety, and enduring foresight. In the final analysis, the Plantagenets were more than kings. They were symbols, masks that concealed the intricate dance of strategy, wealth, and influence. Their reign was a stage, and the true rulers moved quietly behind the curtains, guiding the kingdom through the turbulence of war, the complexity of politics, and the subtle manipulations of faith and commerce. The visible crown held legitimacy, yet the invisible hand ensured stability, continuity, and the careful shaping of history. And as the first light of dawn touched the spires of Westminster, and the river began to glow gold, one truth remained in the shadows. Kings may command the banners and the battlefields, yet the real power flows silently, measured in whispers, ledgers, and coded letters, orchestrating a kingdom with patience and precision. The Plantagenets were the mask, and behind it the architects of England's destiny observed, guiding, and enduring, unseen yet undeniably present, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate and mystify.